Okay.
Hello everyone and welcome to this session in the Global Education Conference called Why and How Collaborative Projects Work Best According to the Mind, Brain and Education Science. And our presenter tonight, or this morning or afternoon, depending where you live, is Andre Hedlund. What we would like to do first is to thank our sponsors and supporters, because without them this education conference would not be able to proceed. And also a big thank you to both Lucy Gray and Steve Harkinen, for without their innovative leadership, again, the conference would not exist. We have a few people in the room, so we'd love you to indicate. I will just give you the tools. You might like to put, if you look at the little laser tool or star on the toolbar on the whiteboard, you could actually pick up a little icon or point to where you're from, or maybe you would like to type it in the chat again, because the previous one, oh, well done, Rana, we've got yours there. So there we've got our 3 countries and 3 corners of the world covered. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Andre. Oh, Phil, it might be too quick for you to come in and do that, Matt, but maybe in the chat you could tell us where you're from. So Andre, without further ado, thank you and over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here once again. I presented here last year, and I talked about how PBL is important in the world of education today. So much of what I'm discussing now will be a continuation of my session last year. I suppose I should turn on my camera. I don't know if you can see me. Okay, there you go. So hello everyone, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm not sure where you're coming from. And to introduce myself, I'm Andre Hedlund. I work as a consultant for National Geographic Learning. I also work as a member, representative of the Mind, Brain, and Education Special Interest Group here in Brazil. And our mission nowadays is to propagate or to promote brain-friendly evidence to help our educators and teachers and, of course, our students to learn better. I also work as the first secretary of Partners of the Americas Goiás. That's a nonprofit institution that works with interchange and volunteer programs. So the session that I'm about to start now is entitled Why and How Collaborative Projects Work Best According to the Mind, Brain, and Education Science. So, well, I'd like to start from Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa's quote. She says, all teachers should embrace medicine's first rule, which is do no harm. And then I'd like to ask you a question. Do you believe we are doing some kind of harm to our students because we are not literate or we don't know exactly how our minds work? So this is my first question to you. What do you think? So you can answer in your chat box there. Are we somehow doing harm in our educational settings because we're not really using brain-friendly strategies to help our students learn? I can see some people are writing. That's a hard question. Yes, indeed. Perhaps especially that our education system focuses a lot on testing, so I'm sure it's stressful for them. Exactly. Perfectly, Rana. Well, I do think we are doing some harm, and I'm going to show you some evidence. And of course, I'm going to suggest a couple of things we can do to stop doing harm. But first, we have to discuss what is MBE. What does it mean? What does it stand for? So mind, brain, and education, it's basically a junction or a cross between 3 areas. So we have cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and education. And as you can see here, this is Dr. Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa's diagram. As you can see, they are all on the same level. So nothing is, neuroscience is not more important than psychology. Phil has just written something. Without question, to not have a vision and understanding of the pathway of learning is a huge roadblock to education today. Exactly, Phil. I agree with you. So anyway, neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and education all on the same level, informing us, teachers, educators, students, parents, how the brain actually works when we're learning. So that's incredibly important, paramount, vital to education. And then we have 6 principles. We have 5 principles that were discussed in Dr. Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa's book. And we have another one that has been added quite recently by the Nobel Prize winner Eric Kandel, Dr. Eric Kandel. So the first principle is human brains are as unique as spaces. I'm not going to go into detail now because later on I'm going to discuss those principles and how they relate to project-based learning. So human brains are as unique as spaces. Then number 2, all brains are not equal because context and ability influence learning. The next one posits that the brain is changed by experience. Number 4 says that the brain is highly plastic in the sense that the brain is flexible and it rewires itself. And then number 5 says that the brain connects new information to old. And finally, Eric Kandel added this one: learning requires attention and memory. So what are the implications if we think about learning, taking into consideration all those principles? If human brains are as unique as spaces, what does that mean when we are teaching, I don't know, 20 or 30 students in the classroom? It means that everybody is different. They have a different background. So how do we take into consideration their needs? How do we cater for what they're looking for in education, right? We also know that learning requires attention and memory. So how do we make sure our students are paying attention? How do we make sure they are able to retrieve that memory, create the memory, and then refer to that memory later on in life? Well, I'm going to show you this. One of the biggest missions of our MBE SIG is to fight the neuromyths. So Tracy Tokuhama says that far too many neuromyths continue to be repeated in educational settings. And just to give you a couple of examples, I'm going to show you a couple of neuromyths or facts according to what MBE knows. So the biggest one that has been propagated for quite a while now is the learning styles myth. So according to a lot of evidence, there is no such thing. Students learn through different learning styles. That's a myth. So we don't really have auditory or kinesthetic or visual learners, predominantly visual learners or auditory learners. What we know is that students learn best if they receive input in different ways. So there are a lot of online tests available to check whether students are auditory or visual or kinesthetic, or sometimes even more. They have even more learning styles. What we know is that students who are predominantly visual, for example, after taking one of those online tests, will not necessarily benefit from just visual input. They will not learn best just by receiving visual input. So that's what learning styles, the whole theory, posits. Actually, to be honest, it's not something that we should really take into account because it's misinterpretation of Dr. Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory. So forget about learning styles. Something else, learning is more effective when we space out our studies. This is true. This is a fact. So how does that impact the way we assign homework, for example, or how much students should learn or study on a daily basis? So, and the next one, the brain records our reality objectively. This is a myth. So our minds are biased. We are always experiencing one of the 6 basic emotions or a mix of them. And the way we look at something is completely different from the way somebody else looks at something. And we are going to refer back to this memory later on in life in a very different way. It could be a positive or a negative way. So we do not record our reality objectively. Bilingualism delays neurodegenerative diseases. Yes, indeed it does. About 5 years, so Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and other types of neurodegenerative diseases can be delayed on an average of about 5 years if you are bilingual. That's good news, right? The right side of the brain is in charge of creativity. That's also a myth. What we know now is that creativity is a global process, and we also know that our brain works with neural networks rather than, specific areas taking care of functions. So our brain is highly plastic is one of the MBE principles, meaning that even if we don't have the left hemisphere, we can use the right hemisphere, and it will take over a lot of the functions, if not all the functions that were supposed to be processed by the left hemisphere. So we have cases of people who have been born with some sort of disorder or damage, injury in their brains, and they had to go to surgery. They had to have surgery, a hemispherectomy. So they had to have half their brains removed, and still they're creative. They can talk. They can speak normally. They might have some sort of impairment in terms of movement, but it didn't really change their lives so drastically as one should think. Another myth is that cognition and emotion are opposite sides of the coin. We know that cognition and emotion, they walk hand in hand. They walk together. So when we say we have to make a rational decision, that doesn't really that doesn't really apply, because we're always making an emotional decision as well. We cannot just turn off our emotions and think rationally. And to end this section of this presentation, I would like to use Howard Gardner's quote. So he said, anybody who's involved in education should become literate in understanding something about the biology of the mind, which means knowing something about the brain and something about genetics. And indeed, we should become literate in the MBE science, because then we know exactly what we can or cannot do to help our students become better learners. Okay, wonderful. So what does that have to do with PBL? What does that have to do with project-based learning? Well, I'll ask you, so I'd like you to comment here in the chat box. Think about homework, for example. Now that you know that we have to space out our studies for learning to be effective, how do we assign homework? How do you work with differentiation, we should anyway, knowing that every brain is completely unique? How do you work with tests and assessment, knowing that, for example, your students are not going to display, I'd say, any signs of learning right after the input of the lesson? Rather, they will show learning throughout a longer period. So learning takes time. So how do you work with assessment, for example? How do you label or not students with learning difficulties? What about your method? So I'd like you to take a couple of seconds, 30 seconds, and think about those things. how would you tackle? So if you want to make any comments about one of those topics, I'd appreciate it. Okay, I can see some people are typing. All right. I'm now thinking that the formative assessment exit tickets are maybe not as effective as we thought. Actually, they are, Rana. I use them all the time. So that's the thing, assessment, right? MBE tells us that formative assessment is much more effective than summative assessment. Of course, you can and you should use both of them, but a number on a test, a grade on the test doesn't really, I would say, envelop or doesn't really show how much the student has learned. And most educational systems in the world, they really focus on summative assessment because it's, in a certain way, it's easier for the institutions to keep track of what their students are doing somehow, but it's not really as great as formative assessment. And Phil says, I believe that it is imperative that educators transition from dictators, exactly, to facilitators of content. Students should have the power to publish their work, showcase their learning journeys. Excellent. I totally agree with you, Phil. Give homework in the form of open-ended tasks. Excellent. Well, so let's move on. And let's talk specifically about project-based learning. If you are PBL enthusiasts like I am, I'm sure you've heard about the Duck Institute for Education. So, and I went to their web page and to this Why PBL section, and they say something that I like very much. They say that PBL, project-based learning's time has come. The experience of thousands of teachers across all grade levels and subject areas, backed by research, confirms that PBL is an effective and enjoyable way to learn and develop deeper learning competencies required for success in college, career, and civic life. Exactly. So PBL is an effective and enjoyable way to learn. And I would like to show you this this thought-provoking image. So what can we take from this image, from this photo? Traditional teaching, traditional learning goes somehow like this. You have a teacher that is the center of the classroom, and the teacher gives some input to the students, and depending on the prior knowledge or the perspective of the students will either get it a certain way or another, right? So this image represents that. Some people will get it as 6, some other people will think it's a 9. And what PBL proposes is that the students investigate or analyze this in more depth. So students would be able, hopefully after having a PBL framework, they would be able to understand that it could be either a 6 or a 9 because they've checked all possible angles. So this is the problem. This figure on the floor is the problem. They have to analyze to go around it to be able to come up with a solution and discuss. So that's why PBL works better. That's why PBL really does work with deeper learning. Now, I would like to talk about the Students at the Center magazine. So if you are familiar with this, excellent, kudos to you. And if you're not familiar, you should become familiar with this. So this is something that Dr. Kurt Fisher at the Harvard Graduate Department of Education and some of his colleagues and other people, other professors from different areas and different institutions, they have come up with. So they started writing this for what they call Jobs for the Future magazine. So it became a very insightful and I would say very objective journal that you can download. Yes, do you have a link to this resource? Yes, Will, just a second. I'm going to share this with you. And it's very interesting. Everybody should read this. And what do you see on the cover? So you see a student, and I think we could all agree that she's working with some kind of project, right? And the student is the center. So we are working with student-centered approaches, and we want our students to have a voice. We want to empower our students. And then I selected a couple of quotes, a couple of mentions and comments from this journal. And the first one is that students are empowered to take responsibility for their own learning. With teachers and other professionals as facilitators, as Phil has mentioned, we should transition from being teachers and especially dictator teachers to facilitators, to learning enthusiasts, but I would say guides rather than just telling our students what and how they should learn things, but help them find out what they can learn and how they can learn best. And another interesting resource, and of course I'd like to mention my blog here. So Andrea Hedlund blog. If you have some time, I'd love if you could check a couple of posts that I have there. And I wrote a couple of months ago this entry: 6 fun games that promote autonomy, choice, and engagement. So I want you to have this ACE concept in mind: autonomy, choice, and engagement. Much of what, yes, I will share the link to my blog here with you. And I write about the fields of neuroscience and cognitive psychology and how you can apply the knowledge in your classrooms. So there it is. Anyway, much of what I got here from much of the research I did refers to this TED Talk, this TEDx talk that was given by Joe Rowe. So he's a high school science teacher from the United States, and he talks about the 21st century skills. I'm sure some of you are familiar with them. So we have the 4 C's of the 21st century skills. And the first C, well, they're not exactly in order, but creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. And Joe, he claims that we should add to the top of the list choice, right? And he talks about how kids in the school, when they go to the cafeteria, they're talking about their options, their choices, and why do we take this away from our education system? Why don't we give the students the choice in how they're going to learn something? So choice is very important. So when you work with PBL, you give students a choice. They, unless of course you dictate what the project should be, but for PBL to really work and to be based on the mind, brain, and education science, choice should be a central element of the whole process, right? And then another very interesting quote is that education should give students opportunities to practice setting goals, tracking progress toward them, adjusting strategies along the way, and assessing outcomes. Indeed, yes. We want students to be able to work with their executive function. So the prefrontal cortex, that is this area of our brain, is responsible for the executive function. So this is vital to making, to planning, to making decisions, to prioritizing and organizing tasks. And when we allow students to work with PBL, they are developing this area. And this area, this part of the brain, is going to be fully developed by the age of 25, 30, somewhere in between. So when we are working with the executive functions of our students, we are helping them develop. We are helping them become better decision makers and better collaborators and planners and everything. So we have to work with that. Another quote is that environments that promote positive relationships and a sense of community promote learning. Now, I think we can all agree that if we are working with PBL students, they are going to bond, they are going to work together and collaborate on a much more interesting level than if they were just having a traditional lesson. And relationships are very important. So we connect with people and we make whatever experience we are having more memorable because we connect with people. And so here I would like to try and explain why I believe that the PBL approach is the best one we have to date in any sort of educational setting. And I'm going to use the MBE principles to show why PBL really works and how it should work anyway. So human brains are as unique as spaces. That's the first principle of MBE. So students have different likes and needs. If we are teaching to the average student, because that's how traditional teaching normally works, we assume that everybody will be somewhere between two different extremes, and then we just teach to the average student, basically. We are not catering for the students' individual needs. So students have different likes and needs. We have to mind that. We have to take that into account if we want to be effective teachers and educators. The second one, all brains are not equal because context and ability influence learning. So if we provide students with a flexible learning experience, such as the one we have in PBL, we can work with differentiation and scaffolding, which are very, very good, which are aspects that we have to take into account. So brains are not equal. Context and ability, I would say nature and nurture, they play a very important role in learning. So we have to take that into account as well. How can you do that if you work with traditional learning? It's harder. But if you work with PBL, that's something that you can definitely adjust to, right? And then the brain is changed by experience. Customized learning pathways and experiences. If the brain is changed by experience and we provide students with a, I would say, challenging, positive experience in which they are supposed to collaborate and connect with other people, you are going to make whatever you're teaching more memorable and easier to access in the future. The brain is highly plastic, meaning that the brain rewires itself. So we should offer students practice in various ways. If we are in a traditional setting that students are sitting and we are speaking all the time, how do we do that? But if you are working with PBL and students stand up and go check something on the computer, or they get a book while other students are watching a video, or students are talking to someone from another country, that really works better, because then you are encoding the information, whatever they're supposed to learn, in different ways. So even though there are no learning styles in a way that students are predominantly this or that, it is useful to think that everybody has all the learning styles, because then you can provide the input in different ways. The brain connects new information to old. So students have different background, again, and schemata to use Piaget's book and theory. So students have different prior knowledge. How do you tackle that in a classroom with 20, 30 students if you are using traditional teaching? Because you assume that if the students got to that level, they are supposed to know everything that came before, or at least most of what they had been exposed to. But we know that's not true, because if you've been a teacher like me for a couple of years, you know that in the same classroom we have students with very different abilities and prior knowledge. Now, when you work with PBL, you can somehow tackle that better, because students will have different roles inside their groups, and maybe they're going to use their strengths to propose something that might benefit the group as a whole. So this is the best way for you to actually check if what they know to that point will help them learn what they need to learn. And then learning requires attention and memory. Yes. And PBL engages students more and makes things more memorable because of the human relationship, the connection. And I remember till this day, and that probably happened, I don't know, over 20 years ago. I remember one of the projects that I was involved with, because we were supposed to build a hydroelectric plant and explain to our parents and other classmates, and of course the teachers of our school, how energy is generated through the engines of the hydroelectric plants. And I remember building the whole thing with wood and plastic and gel, and it is a memorable experience, much more than just sitting in my classroom and watching my teacher talk about potential energy or anything like that. Then another excellent resource, and this one I do not have the link now, but I'd like you to look for The Myth of Average, Todd Rose at TEDx Sonoma County. So Dr. Todd Rose is with Dr. Kurt Fisher at Harvard, and they work at the Department of Education, and they work for the MBE Center at Harvard as well. And Dr. Todd Rose mentions that you, as a person, you are never average. There's no such thing as average. When he talks about how the cockpit of an airplane or a jet actually was designed to the average pilot, and it didn't cater, or it didn't meet anyone's needs, basically, because there's no such thing as average. We have extremes, and we have a lot of different things in between, right? And so we have to take that into consideration when we're teaching. The thing is, we have been teaching for centuries, I'd say, now, to the average students. We want students to have the same sort of knowledge after our classes, and it doesn't. And we have a lot of evidence nowadays showing that it doesn't really work. So we have to take that into account when we are planning our lessons. And hello, Giuseppe, welcome. Well, now let's take a look at PBL put to the test. I'm going to share the experience I've had with my groups this semester. And before anything, I'd like to share this wonderful article by Edutopia. So if you're not familiar with Edutopia, you should be. They have excellent insights on how to use PBL and many other interesting things for teachers and educators. So this was entitled 5 PBL Pitfalls to Avoid. And I would like you to focus on number 2. So focusing on products over process, right? So PBL is about projects, right? Not exactly. While there is a real value in students learning how to create and refine publicly presented learning products, at its core, PBL is powerful because it's an inquiry-driven learning process. If we think of the product as the destination, inquiry is the engine that powers the bus to get us there. Exactly. So it's a process. It's more about the process than the final product, right? So I'd like to share what I've been doing with my students. So this is my freshman group. We call them freshmen here. It's related to the American educational system, but freshman is just a name here. They are my CFR A2 English students, and they're about 12, 13 years old. So in blue, you can see what they are supposed to learn according to their book, the syllabus of their book. So the first unit is food and drink. The second is transportation, then geography and feelings and emotion, right? And the grammar structures that they're supposed to learn, countable and uncountable, nouns, future with present continuous, comparison, and superlative, right? And then I say, you know what? We're going to have the first couple of weeks, we're just going to follow what we've been doing for years, and communicative approach. And we are going to, after the first test, we're going to start PBL. And then I said, well, I want you, students, I want you to come up with a project that you are going to work with. And that's what they came up with. So this is their project. My city, your city. Compare cities regarding food, transportation, geography, and population. And for us to make this possible, we have to have friends. We have to have international friends. We have to connect with people so that we can compare things, right? And we've been using Edmodo, we've been using Iron, we've been using WhatsApp, we've been using all kinds of technologies. And it's been great so far, and I'm going to show some results later on. But the whole process of transitioning from traditional teaching and learning to PBL requires a lot of effort at first, a lot of effort, especially setting out the framework. So I came up with a couple of stages based on mind, brain, and education that I think you can use when you're working with projects. So the first one, the first slide of my typical class is this one, conversation, right? So we have 7-10 minutes to talk about some of those topics. We can talk about just one or all of them. And then we move on to revision. So we go to, so what did we do last class? What do you remember? Can you remember how to use by plus types of transport? What was the most interesting part? What was the least interesting part? So I get some feedback. And then we go on to a brain break. So something that I learned from the mind, brain, and education, science, and neuroscience especially, is that we have to take some short breaks after a couple of minutes. After, anywhere between 15 and 25 minutes, you should stop a little for a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, maybe 2 minutes, even less than 1 minute for your students to relax. And a very good way for us to do that is to use videos if you have the technology. If you don't, you can just play a song or play a game or ask your students to talk about their weekend or anything just to break this highly concentrated mode and relax a little. So this has a lot of evidence. Barbara Oakley, California. We have Robert Bjork, also I think Stanford, California, and they talk about this. Daniel Kahneman, and I can share with you some of the references later. So, and then we go to problem. So this is the PBL framework, right? Problem. And then I normally show them a picture or a sentence or even a video or anything, any kind of stimulus, and I let them talk for about 3 minutes. And they have, so what is the problem? And, based on the picture, what would you say the problem is? So you can write your answers in the chat box. What is the problem? What are we going to talk about? So what is the topic of our lesson today? Anybody? Yes, travel overseas, exactly. So that's it, Anne. Well done. So travel overseas, travel abroad, right? And I encourage them to ask a lot of questions on this stage, right? So, but what do you think might be the problem? And there's passport, there's some cash there. You have an airplane, and then they talk for about 3 minutes, and then we go to this part. So we have some sort of a pre-stage for them to start investigating, right? So, and then we have this. It could be a questionnaire, it could be some sort of exercise to get them thinking. And I talked about this girl who traveled around the world, Laura Decker, maybe you know her, she's from the Netherlands. And then a couple of questions. We watched the very short snippet of her documentary and everything. And then we go to the most important part of our PBL project or process, which is the inquiry part. So sometimes I don't have any questions here. I just show them the picture and they have to ask me a lot of questions. Sometimes I do have questions. So I want them to understand that PBL is all about asking questions, about investigating. So what do you think about Laura Decker? Do you think she had problems on her trip? What problems do you think she had? Do you like her adventure? Do you want to travel alone? Where? What problems can you have? And then they start talking about this. And then we move on to the investigation part. So I am teaching my students how to be curious, how to ask questions, how to question everything, and then how to find the evidence to support their questions. So I use their books as a resource, or if you have some technology, you can use their cell phones to do a little digging on Wikipedia or Google, or you can bring different kinds of materials. So this is the PBL framework. And then finally, we have two other sections. We have the wrap-up. What did we discuss today? What did we learn? Was it interesting? Did I participate? Did I speak English when it was possible? What's my next step? And extension. So I don't call it homework anymore. So I don't work with homework anymore. For me, you know, homework in the sense that you have to do a lot of work, you know, written work, doesn't really work with the different intelligences that your students have, right? So homework for me is extension, is, okay, I'm curious, I want to find out more, I will do it in this way, and then somebody else might do it in a different way. So if you're working with the average student, you know, as we discussed earlier, and you assign the same homework to everyone, you are doing exactly what Dr. Todd Rose tells you not to do, right? So you should work with extension, and just changing the name, you know, moving from homework to extension actually will cause some sort of positive feeling in your student, because homework is not a word that everybody likes, right? So extension. What types of transport are common in our country? What about other countries? Are they the same? And we have a group of people from around the world that they can ask, and they can collaborate to know that. So this is part of a bigger project, right? And so this is the framework that I work with, and it's part of a bigger project. But every class has the PBL framework so that they can get used to, because here in Brazil, it's really hard for us to make this transition anyway. So here we have this, I have two other groups. So I have an A1, CFR A1. They're working with a daily routine, school subjects, sports, clothes, and prices, simple present, negative, affirmative, ability, present continuous. Their project is people around the world, describe people's routines, schools, favorite sports, and clothes. And my junior group, B1 Plus, relationships, investigation, materials, media activities, question tags, possibilities, passive voice, and reported speech. So phase one of our project, All You Need Is Love, is a very creative name for their project. Investigate how people celebrate love around the world, compare Valentine's Day, marriage, and media coverage about love. So this all came from the students, you know. They were the ones who proposed that. And this is a claim I'd like to make here. It works best based on the mind, brain, and education science. It works best if you work with choice, if your students tell you what project they want to work with. And then, so this is how we started. A couple of students went to the board. They started writing down, writing some brainstorming and writing some aspects of what they should research. And then love, investigation, materials, media. So I remember my student Julia came to the board. So Julia was very good at organizing things. So I was working with her individual needs. We had Gustavo, another student, taking notes, making sure everybody would know what to do afterwards. And then Diego took a picture. So everybody's working with something different, but they are together. They're collaborating. It's a project, right? And then I taught them some strategies, the 5 W's and the 2 H's, the strategic planning thing, and then how people celebrate Valentine's Day around the world, where, China, Japan, when, next week, why. So we had gone over why. We didn't have to put it here. Who's going to do it? Julia, what's up? And iron, I think they misspelled iron, and a week. So how much? Once a week, right? And this is, I'm teaching our students, my students, how to be more proactive and take charge of their learning. And then the international help. So we have Amna from Israel and video calling, and then we have Anya from Poland. We have Gustavo talking to Eileen from China and on iron. So the international help, collaboration. And then another very interesting thing I did for my junior group here is how to give them feedback. So forget about grades. I went gradeless. I'm not using numbers anymore to grade my students. I'm just actually giving them a lot of audio feedback, and I'm also giving them the directions for them to keep making their work better. So here you can see that Julia sent me a text, and I sent her a lot of audio messages. And on Edmodo, Gustavo sent me a project. Love is universal emotions. That actually, according to neuroscience, we just have 6 basic emotions, and then I mentioned them, and then try to change that. And maybe you, Gustavo, will be curious. What tool are you using for communication in the slides? So I'm using WhatsApp, the first one here on the left, and Edmodo. Edmodo is a learning management system. It's for free. You can use it with your students. You can set up groups there. They can install the app on their cell phones, and they can get the notifications when you have a message. So it's excellent. And then why do I give them feedback like that? Because I'm using what Dr. Carol Dweck, she's very important for the MBE science too, says. She says the power of yet, right? She's the author of Growth Mindset. So our students, there are students who have a more fixed mindset for certain things, and there are students who have a more growth mindset for certain things. And if you tell them that they got a 5 or a 4 on the test, summative assessment, that will bring them down. That will discourage them, because that's very negative feedback. If they have a fixed mindset, they don't want to be assessed, they don't want to be evaluated. If they have a growth mindset, they will probably try to work harder and get a better grade, right? Thank you so much. Somebody has just shared the power of believing. Perfect. Thank you, Anne. And so what Carol Dweck found out with her research is that if you give students the grade not yet, so you don't give them a number, if you grade them not yet, I think, Phil, thank you so much for participating, Phil. that will put them on a learning curve, on a path to learning, rather than discourage them. So you should definitely use PBL to do that. PBL is the perfect opportunity for you to go gradeless, or at least to give them categories instead of numbers, satisfactory or awesome or yes, thank you, Phil. Anyway, and then what about my student satisfaction after using PBL? So this is what happened. This is interesting because my students, so blue means before PBL and red after PBL. I'd like to bring your attention to just a couple of things because I'm running out of time. So interesting classes, it changed. Learn easily, it changed too. So now they think my classes are more interesting because we're working with PBL, and they think that it's harder, it's more difficult for them to learn. And this is backed by evidence. This is backed by Dr. Robert Bjork. He says that we have to use what he calls desirable difficulties, that learning should be it shouldn't be so easy, it should be challenging, it should be a little difficult for it to actually stick. So I was really pleased, I was really happy with the results of the satisfaction survey. And we are, of course, we're still working with summative assessment. And this is the result of their tests. So before PBL, we got PCT results, so that's their first test. And 74% of my students improved or kept the same grade, 26% decline. After PBL, and I'm not working with homework so much, I'm not really following the syllabus of the book, we're adapting everything. 84% of my students improved or kept the same grade, and 16% decline. So this is evidence that it's working, even though summative assessment doesn't really show you the bigger picture, but it helps show that you're on the right track, right? And finally, for the conclusions, and I think I have a couple of minutes, and of course you can ask me questions. I have 6 conclusions to keep the MBE principles number. So the first conclusion is that PBL is a framework, is a mindset. And you have to get your students used to the idea that they are inquisitors, that they are going to be asking questions all the time if they want to learn in a more productive and effective way. So PBL is a mindset, and I like to use this word mindset because this is exactly what Carol Dweck talks about, right? Now, the second conclusion is that you should focus on the process rather than the product. So even if you don't have a very nice product to show at the end, an exhibition to invite the parents, or if you're working with iron, something online that you can refer to, but they got the mindset, they got the the question and the investigation tools and the curiosity to go forth with that, then it's working. It's definitely working, and it's backed by research. It's the way you do things and not what you do exactly. And use the ACE concept. So try to remember that if you implement in your classroom autonomy, choice, and engagement, your students are going to have much more memorable experiences. And PBL is about real life. So if you move, so the transition may be hard, but you are going towards what people do in life. They work with projects. When you are in an office, you have to collaborate with your colleagues to come up with something, a service or a product. So we are transitioning from something that doesn't really work as it should. I know there are a lot of exceptions, but we're transitioning from something that is very much book-bound, that is very much teacher-centered, to something that actually has been working wonderfully in the last couple of years, according to the latest literature as well. And PBL helps to develop hard and soft skills. So, and my feedback, the summative assessment shows me that students are able to grasp the content of their books, the syllabus, and also the soft skills of working together, collaborating, and empathy and being a sociable person and everything, you are also working with that. Here in Brazil, we have a problem with we call it vestibular. It's an entry exam for universities, and it basically propagates the idea that everyone is a competitor. Every one of your classmates can take your spot if they get a better grade to go to university. So you're working with competition, and it's okay to work with competition, but not at that level. That's bad. So we have to work with soft skills. We have to work with collaboration. And PBL is brain friendly, as it is. So maybe, so my point here is PBL has what it takes for you to be a very effective teacher and for your students to be very effective learners, because it is brain friendly, because it takes into consideration many things that have been discussed by the mind, brain, and education science. So now, my final remarks would be, first thing, let your students decide what projects they are going to work with and help them transition, because if they are here in Brazil, it was really hard for me to make this transition. It took me about 7 months, actually, for everything to be adapted. Adapt your syllabus and don't be afraid to do so. Take a look at your book and say, okay, students, what project can come up, from this syllabus, right? Rethink your framework. Try to use, I don't know if it will work for you. I think it works very well, but try to use conversation, revision, brain breaks now and then. Then you have problem, inquiry, investigation, wrap up, and extension. Go gradeless. Use more formative assessment, and don't use numbers. Try to tell them you're doing great. Why don't you try to improve this and this? Why don't you look this up? Why don't you do this? And finally, get some feedback. And that's it. Thank you very much. This is my blog, my email. You can also follow me on social media, Facebook. If you use the hashtag ZBCRocks, that's my course in MBE Brazil. Mirella Ramaciotti, my mentor, and I really love the work this woman is doing here in Brazil. She's in charge of the MBE SIG in Brazil, so you can, of course, talk to her, and I'm sure she would be glad to answer a couple of your questions. But I think I have 1 minute, maybe, if you have questions. If not, you can access me another day. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Rana. Thank you, Barbara. It was a pleasure.
Yes.
I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Yes?
Andre, I'd like to chip in and say thank you very much. I found the presentation fascinating. The brain is such an unknown quantity, and our manner of learning over the last century really hasn't changed a great deal. So thank you so much for that. Are there any final questions? If not, we'll keep the room open for 1 more minute. Now there is a keynote session which starts in an hour's time. So if you would like to come back in an hour's time, one of the keynote sessions is on, but there's nothing until then. So thank you so much again, Andre. If people want to save the chat, just go to File, Save Chat, and you can choose where to save it.
I will stop the recording now. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.